William.
Greetings, everyone. This is Michael Quinn Patton coming to you from Minnesota. Appreciate your joining us today. This is one of a series of Blue Marble evaluation webinars. Blue Marble refers to the iconic image of the Earth as seen from space without national borders, without silos, our shared humanity. And the Blue Marble evaluation has been developing a set of principles for thinking about global systems transformation, the connection between the global and the local, and how to operate in this rapidly changing environment. And so today, we are especially privileged to be able to get into concrete examples and be able to look at what this means in practice. So I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Page to introduce the details of the webinar and the speakers, but we are glad to have you all wherever you are in the world. Glenn?
Well, thank you, Michael, and greetings, everyone. It's a real privilege to be able to speak with you today. Here, summer in the global north and winter in the global south. And today, it's really a focus on design thinking for transformation. We have two remarkable guests who've really been thinking about design and the challenges of design in many different ways. And we're going to be hearing from Greg Watson and Kirk Bergstrom. And I'll just do a brief introduction of Greg at the beginning. And he's a remarkable person and a really great friend. He's the Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. His work is focused on community food systems and the dynamic between local and geo-economic systems. He spent over 40 years understanding systems thinking, inspired quite a bit by the wisdom of Buckminster Fuller, and applying that in many different ways, and has a whole range of experience from things like leading the urban farmers markets in Greater Boston, serving as the Assistant Secretary in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Economic Affairs, and from his early days working at the New Alchemy Institute in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So I think originally from Cleveland, we are delighted to have you living and contributing significantly in the Gulf of Maine. And let me turn it over to you, Greg Watson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn. I hope I'm going to get this right here in terms of getting my screen up?
Yep, looking great.
All right, well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to put my timer on so I stay focused here. My talk is called 12 Degrees of Freedom, Understanding Our Options for Success. What does that mean? What is the 12 degrees of freedom? To quote from well, it's not a quote, it's a principle discovered by Buckminster Fuller with regard to closed systems. And I'll kind of elaborate a little bit as we move along, but it's the discovery of once a closed system is recognized as exclusively valid, the list of variables and degrees of freedom are closed and limited to 6 positive and 6 negative alternatives of action for each local transformation event in universe. We're talking about transformation, so I think we'll start with that. As some of you probably know, Bucky was probably the most in-depth thinker that I know of in trying to understand the relationship between resources, technology, and meeting basic human needs. I think he looked into that deeper than anyone. And as a result of his investigations, he concluded, almost in the face of conventional wisdom, that we do in fact have enough resources to make everyone on our planet a success. And I think, again, sort of that flew in the face of in conventional wisdom. He went so far as to sort of question the use of our conventional Cartesian coordinate system, which is how we organize our thoughts and organize our science and our measuring tools, and realize that it was inadequate and out of sync with nature's coordinate system, which he discovered. And it took on this shape of a cube octahedron. Won't get into the details there, but that's where the 12 degrees of freedom are derived. The sort of Anthropocene human sort of Cartesian coordinate system is open. The nature or Gaia system is closed. The sort of Anthropocene coordinate system emphasizes and runs on scarcity. Bucky's coordinate system says, no, we have an abundant planet, linear cause and effect versus emergent property. So these are sort of the contrast between these two systems. Unfortunately, we have the still the linear system does in fact permeate society. It's wargaming is still a very active activity that military strategists carry out. It's based on scarcity, the notion of scarcity. It's got to be you or me. And it's a very linear process that is now being incorporated in other types of decision making. The war games really do thrive on accurate and timely information. That's very important, and they have access to that. How you use that information really does determine in many cases the outcome. The slide on the left show, or at least the graphic on the left shows that after 2 decades of the pandemic war games, there was a lack of an imagination in terms of no one predicted this current president or this current situation. So behavior is an important part. Data is important, but we've also got to find a way to sort of incorporate behavior and how people think. And that gets into a certain degree of messiness, which a lot of people try to avoid, but that messiness is all part of the process. The World Game Workshop was created by Buckminster Fuller in the 1960s, and I believe it was in the midst of the Vietnam War. And again, with his understanding of the adequacy of Earth's resources to support everyone, he wondered, why are we fixated on war games when what we should be doing is helping people understand we have the ability to make the world work for everyone, and now we have to figure out venues to help people discover that for themselves. And I think that's an important concept here, is that self-discovery is an important part of the World Game Workshop simulation. I'm bringing the World Game Workshops up because Elizabeth Thompson, former executive director of the Buckminster Fuller Institute and the creator and curator of the Buckminster Fuller Challenge, together, she and I have been awarded the opportunity to steward the World Game Workshops to their next iteration and to resurrect them and bring them into the 21st century. So we're basically trying to figure out how we're going to do that. And before I get into some of the details, just want to kind of go over what are some of the World Game Workshop guiding principles. Now, I don't like wordy slides, and you don't have to read everything. I've tried to highlight sort of the essence of what the sort of guiding principles of our workshop are. And they are that individual citizens are active participants and can be active participants in tackling the world's biggest challenges. We do that by working together to overcome what are seemingly insurmountable problems. We stress you don't have to be an expert or a content expert in order to do this. As a matter of fact, what you have to be an expert in is your own experiences. And if you bring those to the table, we find that those are incredibly helpful in contributing to successful World Game Workshops. We also stress that this type of activity can be empowering and fun. And it stresses systems thinking. And I think the bottom, probably the most important part is that it works if we act with integrity, if we're creative, if we're bold, and this is important if we're truthful. Because I do think that as I go through this, when you look at some of the things, there are going to be probably some inconvenient truths that are out there. Contrast to the war games, linear thinking, are the World Game Workshops. I will say sort of based in large part on design science, planning, comprehensive anticipatory design. So it's not sort of a linear process, and the focus is strategic thinking to solve problems, and to solve problems that will help us actually achieve the goal of making the world work for everyone. So some basic sort of guiding, not some themes for the World Game Workshop. Bucky saw the interplay of certain types of activities in the world that determine a lot of how we can either achieve those goals or where we find they're going to be roadblocks. One is world resources. 92 regenerative elements that we find are what Bucky called nature's minimum inventory, maximum diversity toolkit. everything we experience in the world, everything that we can touch and feel and smell are made from, in the universe literally, are from those 92 regenerative elements. They are unevenly distributed around the world. That just happens to be the fate. They're human trends and needs, evolving trends and needs can be driven by or can create the demand for new resources. It wasn't too long ago that cobalt and some of the rare earth minerals were not sort of on anyone's radar screen. They have emerged in part because of our emphasis and the need to develop renewable energy technologies, electric vehicles. So there's some, and again, this gets a little bit into our, as we explore these, into sort of the being truthful part, because these are also dependent upon some measure of extraction. They're dependent upon metals, they're dependent upon some of those rare earth minerals. And then technologies. Now, Bucky defined, said that wealth is the technologies developed to protect, nurture, and the needs of life. Technologies that drive our current economy, for the most part, were developed by the military as part of their world game activities. They needed to make sure that they had the most tested and performance-based technologies. And I think that's sort of one of the distinguishing factors too, is that they're driven by performance. So the world's game workshop is designed to make the invisible visible, reveals systemic shortcomings in current frameworks, deepen the role of citizens in day-to-day governance, trigger new ways of approaching unfamiliar problems, and harnessing both power of critical and creative thinking. It depends. We also want to build the player's sense of global systems literacy, which means our natural systems, the major habitats and biomes, but it also means human systems. And this is a graphic showing the fragile states index and the condition of nation states around the world. But it also means we also have to explore a little bit of history and understand how we got to the place where we are. And if you look and see what, again, this is just a picture of Africa, or a graphic of Africa before colonialization, and then afterwards you can see how it's carved up that continent. And therefore, when we see current problems, we'll have a sense of where those problems originated. So we need that sense of history as well. I'm going to close with just a couple of examples of sort of applying this. Metal demand for renewable energy generation in the Netherlands, a recent report revealed the fact that the current supply of several critical metals is insufficient to transition to a renewable energy system in the Netherlands. They said, we can't do it. We don't have enough resources. They looked at a number of options, and some of those options include reducing critical metal use through substitution, increasing circular design and recycling, consider European mining industry, digitizing the energy supply chain, and all those could be viable, but some of those also depend upon mining other resources. There's another option, and this was certainly brought forward by Bucky Fuller in the 70s to Jimmy Carter, Leonid Brezhnev, and Pierre Trudeau, and that is to create a worldwide grid. And that world grid would actually allow us to not only take advantage of the night and day and the different wind and solar regimes. The sun's always shining somewhere, the wind's always flowing somewhere, but it also would lead to optimizing resources, because it's sort of become, it's become clear that if every nation state goes it alone to try to meet the renewable energy or the climate change goals, it won't work. There just aren't enough resources to do that. Last example, and that's sort of a global, so a big example of what we have to consider and how we need to approach that particular problem with some real solutions in place. By the way, or at least in play, India and China have both proposed building a world grid. And the question is, where will we play in that role? Where will we play in that scenario? I'm using now a grassroots example, and this is for a group called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative that's in Boston. It's a multicultural community, Latino, African-American, Cape Verdean, white, center of Boston. The one thing they shared in common at the time was that everyone was poor. This was one of the poor sections in Boston. It was highlighted. It was near death in terms of being the victim of a number of activities that had become all too common in many of our cities: redlining, gerrymandering, disinvestment, racist policies, led to a situation where the poverty in these communities really for most folks, I think is unfathomable. I don't think people can understand when you understand that the median net worth of a Black family in Boston, the median net worth is $8. And that's compared to about $247,000 for the average white family. There are a number of reasons for this. They're illustrated in that little chart. And many of those obstacles and racist policies are embedded, some of them embedded in law. So they are systemic. This community was literally as a result of the neglect, the disinvestment, and then ultimately arson for profit was reduced to about 1,400 vacant lots burned to the ground, arson for profit. The city was ready to take the community over, but the residents stood up and said, wait a minute, no, we don't, this urban renewal is not for us. We don't see ourselves in the future in a scheme for urban renewal, because back in the days, back in the 70s and 80s, urban renewal for most Black residents meant Negro removal. So they said, there's gentrification and then we're displaced. So they created their own database and they started to build a model of an urban village that involved citizens. They were working together. They posted it all over. They started talking about their dreams and their vision. And they were able to utilize different tools and technologies. One was a community land trust. The community land trust was a bold step in this community of diverse, low income, poor residents, because they put the emphasis not on individual wealth, but on community wealth. And they said, we cannot guarantee individuals can prosper, but we can do what we can to try to make sure that the community is one of those, part of the rising tide. And what they were able to do was actually accomplish something that professional planners have been unable to do, and that is to couple gentrification from displacement. This headline is a little misleading because we don't necessarily see that the gentrification is the problem. We want to see people lifted and economically, but the problem was, how do you do that and avoid the tax rates going up so that it actually pushes people out of communities? And people had no idea how to do that. I think the interesting thing about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, the community, the values that emerged from that was that they sacrificed it. Of course, home build and home ownership was one of the ways that you actually begin to build wealth, to get over that $8 of net wealth. But this community said the way that we're going to preserve the community and stifle speculation from developers is to suppress the value of our property, to make it unattractive to developers. Unheard of. Banks didn't know how they would actually issue a mortgage under those conditions. And the community convinced them that they would be able to attract not speculators, but people who wanted to live in the community. And I use this as an example because it is a different way of thinking, and it puts the priorities, it puts the community above the individual, but it also makes the conventional wisdom sort of pale and elevates and empowers this community as real, honest to goodness problem solvers. Evaluation were done both statistically, but also GIS mapping, where you could begin to see how this neighborhood distinguished itself from the surrounding neighborhood in terms of land value, in terms of foreclosures and all. And it really was a tremendous, and still is, a tremendous success. So I'm going to close with this quote from a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, Richard Powers, called The Overstory. You can probably, I'll let you read it because this sort of does describe, I think, sort of where we see the World Game Workshops, what it pulls out of people, what we're trying to do with it. And it is trying to figure out what we can all do to find out and discover what this desperate new world that we're emerging to wants from us. So we're still pivoting right now because the coronavirus has sort of it's made us change our plans. The old workshops were in person, large groups of young people or people in general coming together in large venues like gymnasiums and role play. That's not going to happen in the near term. So we're pivoting now and trying to design the most effective online presence that we can as we await the time when we can emerge from this current crisis and start to resume some sense of normalcy, but with a new vision for the world based on, hopefully, the World Game Workshop and the work of others. Thank you.
Oh, Greg, thank you. What a tour de force. So much to cover there. The work that you're describing, and in terms of the relevance to the Blue Marble principles, I mean, you really bring up global systems literacy as a core component to global thinking principle within Blue Marble. And then, of course, the global to local, taking this global systems literacy and applying it at a local context in the Dudley Street neighborhood and, of course, elsewhere in your career. The Anthropocene as context, offering that Gaia framing alternative, this transformative engagement principle that's central to Blue Marble evaluation. You remind us of both the need for things to be powerful and fun, but also to surface the inconvenient and truthful, extremely important. And then this overarching integration principle, which is central to Blue Marble evaluation. You're really asking for a different way of thinking, a new paradigmatic shift. So, so wonderful. Well, so folks, if I see that there's some really good chat going on in the chat box, if anyone has specific questions for Greg, frame them in the chat box. We'll see if we can get to them. But let me turn over the mic to Kirk Bergstrom. And Kirk, again, longtime friend, and he's actually he was the board of directors of the Buckminster Fuller Institute for 13 years, served as the vice chair, and he's a master storyteller, an educator, entrepreneur. Just actually gave a course at University of California, Berkeley on this design thinking process, and also a role as a filmmaker. He's written and directed Emmy Award-winning television and Disney and PBS shows, including Spaceship Earth, Our Global Environment, Power Shift, Energy plus Sustainability, and Nourish, Food and Community. So a real geospatial thinker and an interactive genius with design thinking. Let's turn it over to you, Kirk, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Greg. Such a pleasure to be with a like-minded network of planetary thinkers. So I look forward to sharing our work. Let me get to share screen here. All right, so today I want to introduce a nascent initiative that we're calling Imagine.world. And before you race out to look for the website, let me just say that that is not yet live. So that is a name now and will be a presence soon. And we really do see our overarching kind of mission as design for global transformation. I think we are living in a time when questions are extremely important. And two of the most significant questions I would pose to this group are, how do we mobilize as a species to successfully address our critical challenges? And how big can we think? That notion of expanding context, which actually makes it easier sometimes to discover integrated solutions. So the structure of my presentation is largely going to be around questions. And I look forward to those being evocative and provocative. So this is a simple geometric model that really speaks to what motivates this Imagine.world initiative. And this is all very familiar to this group. Of course, we have complex interconnected global challenges. The scale is unprecedented. We have that fierce urgency of now, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. What I think is the opportunity, though, is this potential for synthesis and collaboration. Synthesis across disciplines, across sectors, across geographies, and then really a new form of collaboration, one that transcends the nation state and that stitches us together in new ways. And this call today is a perfect example of how we're doing that. So this is a very simple visualization of our vision of transformation and what we want to ultimately accomplish with Imagine.world. So one of the key needs that we see is this need for a coordinated strategic response by human societies to these planetary scale challenges that we face. And that's going to require a design process and implementation process that's really global to local and that does produce transformational change. And where we're headed, of course, is to enable the emergence of a regenerative future and a regenerative culture. And I think this question really speaks to what it means to have a regenerative mindset. How do we celebrate the ability of living beings to co-evolve so that our planetary home continues to express its potential for diversity, creativity, and complexity? To me, this really speaks to the heart of what it means to be a human being in a Gaian kind of perspective, as Greg so eloquently spoke to us about. This is a question that I think is so rich and one that we should all be reflecting on. How do we narrate a new ethos, a moral imperative, and a new mythos, our collective story? I think we're just at the beginning of really understanding this incredible shift in our narrative capacity, and I think we're all going to be looking for ways to achieve this. And when you talk about a new ethos and mythos, I think we all have to ask this question and acknowledge this question, which is, how does culture act as the deep rudder of social change? And this beautiful painting is a mural in the Mission District of San Francisco. And if you look closely, it really, I think, evokes what culture means. We have, the generations represented from children to grandparents, the role of things like music and creative expression, the deep relationship to place and to land. So I think, again, this is something that in our work we have to pay very careful attention to. And of course, we need to shift paradigms. And Greg opened this conversation in his presentation, and some of these are an echo of what he spoke to. As you read this, from and to, one of the things I'd like you to reflect on is, what are the kinds of experiences that we might create that enable these paradigm shifts? What are the experiences in terms of learning, in terms of practice, in terms of collaboration? Because these don't just happen on their own accord. They really emerge from the experiences we have throughout our lifetime. And one of the really juicy questions for me is, how do we practice collective sense making? And I'm no expert on sense making. It's a field that I'm just really beginning to learn about. I think it has tremendous potential, though, and this is a short definition below: a process that enables people, often with different perspectives, to transform the complexity of the world into a springboard for action. And to me, this is one of the real missing pieces in our work, which is, we all encounter that need to begin creating a common language, a common vision, and yet we encounter very diverse perspectives and experiences and geographies. So I think we have to get very good at the practice of sense making. And that is one that we will continue to talk about together. Another real goal of Imagine.world is this idea of democratizing the process of designing our common future. And one of the things that I've encountered in my professional life is, there are these institutions that exercise a lot of power, and those can be everything's from traditional governments to large corporations to large philanthropies. And what we have not done well is open the process of anticipating and designing our future to the largest number of people. And as Greg spoke about the world game, that was really a core idea of Buckminster Fuller's, the idea of open and participatory design and planning. So that is core to our mission as well. I also think we live in an era where we just have to pay attention to the question of how we equip and support young people. I love this quote from Greta Thunberg, you know, change is coming, whether you like it or not. And there's such a reservoir of latent potential with young people that we really need to find ways to involve them as fully as possible. And, you know, this is central too. How do we grow and connect the number of people capable of practicing comprehensive design? So the work that Greg and Elizabeth are doing with the World Game Workshop, certainly just the principles themselves from Blue Marble evaluation, all of these things I think are coming together to kind of grow our bench, to grow our capacity, because we are going to need hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are capable of planetary scale thinking and design. And, you know, given our era, given the advances in technology, I think we have to really understand and explore this question about combining human foresight and ingenuity, our kind of innate capabilities as human beings, with computer and visualization tools so that we can navigate systems change. Just to tell you a little bit about that image that's underneath the question, that is a visualization of all of the distinct languages in the world. And one of the fascinating things that's been discovered is areas of the world that have high biodiversity tend to also have high language diversity, which is a really interesting connection. This is one that I personally have a strong leaning towards, which is how do we skillfully combine art and science? And I think one of the ways that we do begin to really get to that cultural root is understanding the power of the arts, both visual and narrative and text. So that is also one of our emerging capabilities to develop. These are 12 principles that we have identified for Imagine.World. Again, some echo of Greg's presentation. And as you read these, think about this as a pattern integrity. As Greg was mentioning, you know, Buckminster Fuller really looked at the geometry of the world, the geometry of nature. And these principles really connect in that way. They have a relationship to one another. One really evokes questions for another. And the other thing, as you're reading this, I would invite you to think about is, how does this translate into a curriculum? How does it translate into professional practice, professional learning? So these are all you know, entry points. And I think you'll see that there's a tremendous alignment with the Blue Marble principles as well. So now I want to get to kind of the heart of the operational model that we are thinking about for Imagine.World. And consider this very simple diagram as kind of our functional definition or operational model for how Imagine.World would function as a design process, as a collaborative process. So we've identified three principal roles. There's a player, someone who would be actively pursuing a design challenge and design strategy. There would be supporters that would be mentors, technical advisors, supporters in any number of disciplines that would be part of ensuring the player and teams would have access to the best thinking. And then sponsors, as you might imagine, really are part of the funding, both financial and in-kind, for the type of challenges that would be undertaken by players and teams. And then this tetrahedron on the right, the design functions, really speaks to what we think is a powerful way to bring together a number of functions for planetary scale and local scale design. So I'll just walk through each one quickly. The Academy, as you might imagine, really is about learning. It's about developing the capabilities of those three roles on the left so that they are really prepared to do planetary scale thinking and design. And imagine those three roles, the player, supporter, and sponsor, each taking a slightly different path through the Academy in terms of courses or practice, but all emerging with a common language, some common understandings, some common capabilities that kind of create this universe where people really are prepared to collaborate. The observatory is a scanning and sense-making function. So think about how we would be able to aggregate, synthesize, and analyze big data, warm data, but really begin to understand critical trends and relationships and point toward what are the high leverage kind of challenges that, if solved, would address multiple problems. So you always want that ripple effect and kind of strategic intervention point. So the observatory helps us to understand that. And then the observatory, in terms of its data analysis and forecasting, informs the navigation center, which is really a capability of mapping and visualization. So this would engage things like digital globes and maps, the ability to look at trends over time within a geospatial kind of environment, and really take advantage of that innate capability we have to recognize patterns, to recognize relationships, to see where things are in terms of their geographic context. And then the game board is really the place, and this would be largely an online platform, although it would have, you know, real world instantiations in terms of facilities and that sort of thing. But the game board is where the challenges are addressed, where strategies are developed, where proposals are put forth, where sponsors fund those proposals, where teams collaborate, where they connect with other teams, with supporters. So really what we're trying to do is create an ecosystem here that enables the most robust kind of design and planning possible, and one that is not reliant on a national government or a big corporation, but really bubbles up from the grassroots. And you know, this is the democratization part that I was speaking to earlier. So this is a very surface, very simple explanation of the Imagine.world ecosystem. We've done a lot of thinking, and of course, we invite your participation as this evolves. Very quickly, we have also defined this capability called the Hive, which is a globally distributed infrastructure. As you can see, it has functions like governance and communications and network weaving. So that is another piece of the Imagine.world ecosystem. Glenn, just want to do a quick time check. How are we doing?
We're doing good. I'd say maybe wrap up in maybe 3 or 4 minutes with a solid Berkeley course summary and any other final thoughts.
Sounds good. So Glenn alluded in the introduction to a course that I co-taught at UC Berkeley in the spring. And really, we were asking this question: how do you shift mindsets, build a common language, and develop new capabilities? And had the opportunity to really explore multiple disciplines and to begin to connect these in terms of the students' practice. So this really, you might think about as kind of the emerging curriculum for the academy. And one of the things that we had the students build upon was this Exponential Roadmap, which is a very comprehensive global strategy to have emissions by 2030. So that was a really nice piece for the students to work from. This is from a student presentation. By the end of the semester, they are proposing a strategy to reverse climate change. So you can see how the thinking was enlarged. We asked the students in a final evaluation, how did your thinking change through this course? And you can read some of the student reflections. My favorite one is this last one. My first question when starting a project is no longer, how do I make this work? It's how do I make this work for everyone, everywhere? So just to wrap up, I think our joint work together is really about co-learning and co-design. So these are what we consider to be next steps with Imagine.World. And we really just want to invite all of you that are part of the Blue Marble Evaluation Network to play a part in this process. And as you kind of go around this pentagon, you'll see on the left, design, test and design, or test our design process through a series of pilots. And we're looking at pilots at different scales, from planetary to bioregional, the notion of cities and ecosystems. So one of the things I would invite all of you to propose are potential pilot projects that will enable us to test the Imagine.World design process and ecosystem. And we are indebted to your work with the Blue Marble Evaluation. We consider it sort of our North Star when it comes to evaluation, and are looking forward to involving you in our process of learning and adapting. So, final couple slides here. I really feel like we are living in an era where the notion of radical collaboration is essential. And the short definition here is an ethical framework based on positive sum rules that ensures a flourishing future for all. So how do we best collaborate to accelerate transformational systems change? We'd love for you to join our network. And if you want to do a screen grab or any other form of documenting this URL, please let us know of your interest, and we would be delighted to find ways for you to contribute. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure to present.
Awesome. Kirk, thank you so much. And Greg, I mean, really remarkable. And both of you taking time out, and Kirk's actually on a family road trip, was just celebrating his mother's 90th birthday. So thank you, Kirk, for taking out some time on family time to do this. But the richness of what you both presented was remarkable. And rather than me posing questions, I'm going to just try to take a few synthesis ideas from the chat and maybe actually a few specific questions. First one goes to you, Greg. And this is regarding issues of differential power dynamics and looking at the work that you pioneered in Dudley Street neighborhood and thinking of and watching its evolution over time and seeing, as one of the participants said, that the work really hasn't necessarily stopped the gentrification of the neighborhood, but the ideas actually helped to, in some ways, grow it. So what's your thoughts of how the evolution of these ideas have played out in some of the places where you've worked so hard to inculcate them into the way of thinking, way of acting, and way of being in these communities?
Yeah, let me just say that was a good point. I think that the notion of gentrification, see, the gentrification as we, as the Dudley residents, started to see what was happening in their neighborhood, what they realized was that gentrification was not the problem. It was gentrification if it's coupled with displacement. And the conventional wisdom was you could not pull those two apart. If you had gentrification, then that meant that we're going to be forced from our neighborhood. The beauty of Dudley Street and this community was, let's redefine, let's take a look. Can we decouple those? Because we'd like to see our lot in life improve, but can we do it in a way that doesn't invite all the negative aspects? As a matter of fact, we visited Jay Forrester. I don't know if Jay Forrester, MIT, the guru of systems thinking, he at his MIT office, and he said to us, you've got to build in some negative, aspects that not for your community, but things that will make, that are negative to speculators. So here's what I guess what I'm saying is, the community, not us, we were staff, but the community redefined and sort of retooled they changed the narrative. I think that's one of the things that Kirk pointed out. The narrative changed and we started to see things differently. And if you can do that, even to the community that was affected and said, wait a minute, we've got it not exactly right, that's a huge step.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And this is another question, really taking these ideas of effective local work, which of course requires enormous, that collective sense making to deeply understand context, and not just understand externally, but really understand it together, where people from the place are seeing themselves. Is that scalable? Does scale play a role here in terms of scaling horizontally, so in other places, and then also scaling vertically from community to more the sort of the bioregion and beyond? So let's begin with you, Greg, and then over to you, Kirk, on that question.
I think it is. I think the challenge we have, it comes back to being able to tell the story and extract the general principles from the special case. But in some cases, you have to know the details. I think one of the things that happened in Dudley is that they had an opportunity. They seized, there was a political context, right? Of quarter busing, things were happening in Boston. The mayor had just finished a contentious campaign against the first Black mayoral candidate, and he won, but he wanted to make it up to he wanted to win back the Black community. So they seized the opportunity and then got an opportunity to actually acquire land. One of the things that we were trying to be careful of, and the direct answer to your question is certainly scalable horizontally. And I think that one of the points I wanted to make was that to me, it's impressive that you can have an experience that was done by a grassroots multicultural organization that I think has implications at the global level in terms of empowering them, in terms of their value system, in terms of using the tool of community land trust to shift the emphasis from individual wealth to community wealth, which then creates a whole new situation. And I'm going to give Kirk that, but if you look at what's happening in cities like Cleveland and Detroit, what's happening, the house that my grandmother from Tennessee came up and bought and was going to be the beginning of our source of wealth for our family is now valued at something like $19,000 after her 30, because the community around it deteriorated. And so what the Dudley Street model was, can we prevent that from happening? So we can't ensure your wealth, but if we can sort of build the community's wealth, that's the best thing that we can do. So I think that model is scalable other places and also horizontally and vertically.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. Kirk, over to the Imagine.world concept. And I'll add a different scale dimension: scaling deep, scaling wide, and scaling up. How does that play out with the Imagine.world vision?
Well, I think the question to ask and sort of the paradigm to step into is the idea of nested systems. So when we begin to conceptualize nested systems, they're all connected. There are through lines in multiple directions. And so I think that's what's important. It's not that there's one way that's better than another way. It's really that we begin to conceptualize this idea of nested systems. So from the most local to the most global, there are connections. And if we don't see those connections, our strategies and our solutions are going to be incomplete. And, you know, I do have a slight, I guess, bias in the sense that I do think that when we start with the whole and work to the more specific, you know, we tend to see those connections more clearly. However, there's nothing that replaces the energy and relevance of the local experience. And so, you know, that is where a lot, you know, of the wisdom and knowledge accumulates. And we obviously want to tap that. I think what Imagine.world aspires to do is really have the multi-directional kind of exchange where communities are sharing their local knowledge with other communities, particularly at a bioregional kind of level, where the planetary kind of context is informing local. And, you know, we're learning across up and down, and as a result, you know, really taking advantage of all the best thinking.
Excellent, excellent. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the chat around power asymmetries. And this is a wonderful note. Getting rid of a sense of social superiority / inferiority is close to impossible to achieve given the dominance of Enlightenment thinking in large swaths of the world. We literally need to turn that long-standing paradigm around. I'm truly uncertain about whether it is possible on any feasible scale. You're both offering ways forward for really design thinking around transforming that essence. So Greg, over to you on sort of the issues of power asymmetries and how the World Game Workshop has a way forward to address power asymmetries.
Yeah, I would say that to a large extent, the power that exists and that say nation state have is because they've been able to successfully keep the invisible invisible. And so there is a lack of understanding about literally about how the world really works. And so as we start to sort of look at the issues of power structure, for instance, and once again, I'll use my example of Dudley Street. We were once criticized because someone said that the way you get someone's attention is that you protest and you know, right, and you wage demonstrations. And this was an organization that said we are non-confrontational. When I said is, if you're non-confrontational, you have that ability because you have some leverage. And in their case, the leverage was dollars, and it could also be power. One of the things that was so interesting, once again, I'll use this special case about this neighborhood, was that they acquired power and actually leveled the playing field when they got access to land. And land in Boston, it used to be that the plans that the city or developers had were imposed upon them. They were told, you know, basically had no say. When they acquired, we can get into how they acquired land, but when they became the owners of the land, and again, it's important to point out, not individual landowners, collective. It's a community land trust. We speak in unison, and now developers have to come to us and say, what are your requirements? And what the community did was collectively establish community standards. These are the minimal standards that a new housing development has to have before we'll even consider. And we want to see your individual architectural plans. And it wasn't bullying and it wasn't arrogance. It was basically saying, we want to make the process visible to all of our residents so that you now can see where we can intervene and where we can take leadership. So I think it is really sort of showing that the emperor really has no clothes or making that invisible visible.
Yeah, beautiful. And then we'll call this the final question. We'll put it over to you, Kirk, before we hand it over to Michael. This really is sort of a question about if we were to imagine .world, if we were to imagine then shifting old paradigm of white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, and colonialism to valuing those who have been historically marginalized, the acknowledgement of the structural inequities and access, sense-making, and shifting mindsets is not just about moving paradigms, but examining power differentials. How does Imagine.world help us in that way?
Well, I think this is one of the core questions of our time, is how we deal with the power imbalances. And you know, my sense is that it's a combination of active, collective sense making, where we have an opportunity to learn from one another, question our own assumptions and experiences, uh, begin to tell stories to one another in a way that reveals our humanity. I think that is just essential. And then, you know, it really is about giving people access to tools, processes, so that they can actively participate in creating a future that they want to inhabit. And I'm such a big fan of what emerges from co-learning and co-design. So, you know, the co-learning is really a place where I think we can begin to question these power imbalances, look at alternative structures, alternative, you know, institutions. What is it going to take? These are not going to be easy, and yet we have to bring you know, fresh ideas to the table. And then I think just the act of collaboration has its own magic. And you know, when it moves from how do we create a future that we all want to live in, you know, that's something where you can stand shoulder to shoulder, and where you want to draw on, you know, the deep indigenous wisdom, you know, as well as the latest technology. So, you know, the challenge is, how can we bring together the best of humanity? And that goes deep in terms of, you know, indigenous culture. It goes deep in terms of ecological knowledge. And it also draws on, you know, our capacity to be innovative and ingenious as well. So I don't think anyone has all the answers, and you know, that's why I wanted to pose a number of questions today. And I'm really glad that this group is posing that one, because it is a linchpin issue.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. This really has been remarkable. This is true design thinking for a future that we think all want to live in. So let's hand it over to you, Michael, to bring us home and provide some insight and reflection on what you've heard.
Thank you very much for participating and for the presentations, both Greg and Kirk. Tremendous stuff. Part of what comes up for me in terms of one of the Blue Marble principles of integration is the ongoing challenges of design itself being treated as a separate activity from implementation, evaluation. Design carries the connotation of a thing, of an it. In some ways, I'm struck by the oxymoronic nature of designing for complexity, when the whole notion of complexity is that you can't control it. And so design, the control aspects of design are one of the challenges, and you're dealing with that. But it strikes me that one of the language and conceptual challenges we have going forward is how to have people engage in real-time ways under conditions of uncertainty, unpredictability, structural imbalances, racism, and that design suggests that these things can be controlled in a way that strikes me as problematic. I come away from this actually more skeptical about the language of both design and evaluation over the last year, because they have such static histories and are so caught up with notions of control. The Black Lives Matter movement, the movement around environmental justice, trying to bring together equity with environmental and sustainability concerns, the Me Too movement. These things are not getting designed. They're emerging, they're dynamic, they're responsive. We need design kind of thinking and evaluative thinking and strategic implementation. But it seems to me that that part of what I take from some of the comments in the chat and our challenges going forward is to break down the silos between design, implementation, evaluation, different levels, and that the very notion that we're in control is one of those barriers. And that's where Blue Marble evaluation for transformation and especially fits, is the notion that we're not in control is part of the transformation. The enlightenment that Zinda brought up, the issues of structural and systemic racism are all coming from fixed places of analysis in a world that's increasingly dynamic. So we look forward to working with you on how we make sense of the very things that we've inherited around how to do this work, beginning with Bucky's War Games, Mind Games, Global Games, World Games, and how we make sense of all this. Thank you for stimulating us, for helping us think about these things. Thanks for all you for participating. Our next Blue Marble Book Club is on August 27th on the topic of yin and yang, which in some ways is part of what this is about, where we deal with both being in control and not being in control, trying to predict and knowing that things are not predictable, how we deal with some of those tensions. Thank you all. Glenn, you have a final word?
Well, just to say, Michael, thank you, and way to bring us home with a thoughtful, reflective aspect of the integration of design, implementation, and evaluation, and realizing the illusion of control. So with that, I encourage you to have an emergent afternoon and a wonderful end of summer, end of winter, and stay tuned to the Blue Marble website for future webinars. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.